As Britain's new Labour government settles in, they are grappling with a vexing economic challenge inherited from their predecessors. The conundrum has put Chancellor Rachel Reeves in a fiscal straitjacket, caught between fiscal responsibility and funding the overhaul of public services that was central to her party's electoral mandate. The previous Conservative administration left a £16.4 billion black hole in the public finances. Reeves revealed this week, describing a litany of unfunded and undisclosed spending commitments left on the government's ledger. This shortfall comes at a time when Labour is looking to deliver on promised reinvestment in the National Health Service, education, climate initiatives, and more after over a decade of austerity policies. However, Reeves' ability to increase borrowing to fund new spending is hamstrung by a self-imposed fiscal policy commitment for the national debt to be declining as a percentage of GDP within 5 years. This constraint was inherited from her Tory predecessors and reaffirmed by Labour before the election as a signal of fiscal prudence to markets and voters concerned about escalating debt loads. Yet there are already rumblings that the new government may game this fiscal framework to create more borrowing flexibility. By tweaking the specific debt metric targeted, from the narrow public sector net debt excluding the Bank of England's balance sheet to the broader public sector total, economists estimate the Chancellor could effectively release £16 to £20 billion in additional borrowing headroom. The rationale is not merely about finding a clever accounting trick, but rather updating an archaic framework out of step with the realities of quantitative tightening and the BOE's unwinding of its balance sheet in the wake of loose pandemic-era monetary policy. As the central bank sells off government bonds, it is crystallizing steep capital losses that are directly adding to measured debt levels under the current methodology, despite representing merely an asset transfer between public authorities rather than new demand for private financing. In November, Reeves seemed to rule out such a fiscal framework rejig, stating, "We will use the same models the government uses," and vowing not to fiddle the figures. However, pressed by her predecessor this week on whether she would consider changing debt metrics, the new chancellor conspicuously avoided reaffirming that commitment, saying only that fiscal rules are non-negotiable, while declining to specify which measure would be targeted. There are sound arguments for the switcheroo. The broader debt aggregate was the principal metric from 2010 to 2021 and is seen as more transparent, not subject to distortions from the BOE's crisis gilt purchase schemes. Markets would likely accept the change pragmatically, according to economists, especially given how much of the measured debt load is effectively just an intragovernmental obligation based on quantitative easing accounting conventions. By taking the high road of not locking themselves into an arbitrary, pre-pandemic relic of a fiscal metric, Labour could buy themselves vital fiscal space to begin restoring Britain's safety net and public services after over a decade of austerity. Trimming the BOE's policy independence is a small price to pay. Moreover, the move would helpfully depoliticize the quantitative tightening process, as one BOE insider described it to me. Under the current setup, the speed at which the central bank shrinks its balance sheet directly impacts the Chancellor's fiscal math, potentially interfering with the separation of monetary and fiscal policy spheres and creating awkward incentives to lean on the BOE. A broader debt aggregate would wall that off. To be sure, there are risks to toying with fiscal guardrails before even taking office. It could be perceived as the new government lacking discipline and reverting to old Labour profligacy. Markets may demand a premium to finance a debt splurge, undermining at least some of the fiscal headroom created by the new framework. Ultimately, though, having won a mandate for change, it would be folly for Labour to shackle itself to a suboptimal fiscal framework conceived in a different economic era. A modern debt coverage metric would enhance transparency while providing the flexibility required to begin turning around Britain's crumbling state. For a centre-left government taking power midway through the 2020s, rejuvenating the public realm and transitioning to a greener economy should be the priorities, not outdated accounting conventions serving as a stultifying fiscal straitjacket. With judicious deployment of the borrowing headroom, Reeves can lay the groundwork for Britain's next era of renewal and progress. The politics of austerity have had their decade. Now is the time to judiciously invest in the future.